This is a man's world. This is a man's world. But it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.
I wanted to come back to the radical feminists, their accusation that married women are, or what they said at least they were, the property of their husbands. So was that too strong?
I don't like to use that language very often for a couple of reasons. One, it doesn't really reflect the historical diversity of marriage because marriage has looked really different in practice than it does in theory. There have been many marriages that in private were a lot more loving and even egalitarian than the culture said they should be. But two, it also feels a little bit disrespectful in our American context because there have been in our country people that have been very literally openly bought and sold. And they weren't all women. In fact, women were often part of that system of buying and selling and owning. So I would rather back up and ask this question a slightly different way and narrowing our conversation just to Western history for the sake of time. Is it more true to say that women have functioned as property in Western markets or as property owners? So, if those were the only two choices, it was a multiple choice question with two choices on it, like which would you choose? It's more true that women have been property or that they have been property owners.
Okay, so to answer that, then we're going to have to do a history of women's relationship to property in the West, right?
Hmm. Yeah, and I would say that kind of starts with the Greco-Roman world. And marriage in ancient Greece was something that would be arranged between a father of the proposed bride and the bridegroom, usually. So the mother of the bride was not involved in this process, and the bride herself was not involved in the process. She just got told, this is who you're marrying. Under Roman rule, the bride's rights did increase a little bit. Her consent was required for a legal marriage. And that was definitely an improvement from how things had been before. But we have to keep in mind that the bride was usually only 14 or 15. She could be as young as 12. There was actually a whole ceremony where the bride, as part of preparing for marriage, was to dedicate her childhood toys and clothes to the household gods. So that's how close to childhood this consent was taking place.
Mm.
Um, there were some Greco-Roman women who, these would be mostly widows or very wealthy single women, that were able to act independently, represent themselves legally. But mostly Greco-Roman women operated under a lifelong male guardianship. And that would be first her father's, usually, or maybe a brother if he was not alive. And then it would transfer to the husband. So, the most important part of a Roman wedding ceremony, for instance, was this moment of legal transfer of the bride, where the father of the groom would give her away, literally giving away his authority over her as his daughter, to put her under the authority of her husband. And it's significant that that moment was marked by a financial transaction, and it be at least a token transaction to show that I am purchasing your daughter. I am compensating you for her virginity. Um, so it's not off the wall to be like, that is a financial transaction going on. This woman is
Yeah.
being transferred from the ownership of one man to another.
Yes.
The husband had authority over his wife's sexuality, but the reverse was absolutely not true. There were no laws against marital rape. Men were expected to be unfaithful. They were not expected to be virgins when they got married. And a husband was actually in his legal right to kill an adulterous wife and the man she was with if they were caught in the act. But on the other side, male infidelity was really not even a legal category. Like, you weren't committing a legal offense against your wife. If you messed around with another man's wife, you were committing a legal offense against that man. But there was no legal space for, you've wronged your wife. What are we going to do to make this right? Um,
Right.
the husband had the right to direct his wife's labor, and if she had any earnings from her labor, he could take control of those and use them any way that he saw fit. He controlled the fruit of her reproductive labor. He could actually unilaterally decide whether to keep a newborn child or discard it within, he had like 10 days usually to decide, and they would place the baby in front of him, and he would decide whether to pick it up and give it a name or say, no, we're not keeping this one. Yeah.
I think some Christians, they would see all this and they'd be like, "Okay, okay," but the Romans weren't Christians. So of course they treated women like property, and then Christianity came along and women have been better off ever since, happily ever after. So did Christianity make conditions better for women?
So, yes, because of Christianity's Jewish roots, yes.
Mm,
Uh, and we see this in the New Testament because women owned private property. For example, there are three examples here. Women who supported Jesus out of their private means, that we see in Luke 8, verse 3. Even married women whose husbands were alive, they weren't just widows, right? Like managing the leftovers. They were alive and they had their own property. The wives had their own property, like Joanna, the wife of Chusa, Herod's steward. Number two, second category, women who own their own homes. So we see a bunch of those folks in the New Testament. Uh, they seem to be mostly Jewish. Mary, the mother of John Mark in Acts 12:12, Lydia of Thyatira, who's a wealthy Jewish woman, successful businesswoman who urged Paul and his team to stay at her house. And Luke says she calls it my house. Nympha, who's a Christian woman in Colossae, Paul singles her out as the host of the church that meets in her house, Colossians 4:15. Husbands are not mentioned in all these cases. So these women had authority to offer hospitality. And in the case of Chloe in Corinth, Paul says, "It has been reported to me by Chloe's people" in 1 Corinthians 1:11. She was probably the head of a household and leader in the church. And then the third category is widows in 1 Timothy 5. At least some widows led house churches and functioned as elders, usually because there was an age gap between wives and husbands by maybe about 10 years on average. And so there were, of course, going to be a lot of widows. And they functioned as elders and house church leaders. We can tell because in 1 Timothy 5, verse 17, Paul comes back to the topic of preaching. Preaching. So widows were preaching. Then there were reforms under Constantine. So, when we look at the impact of Christian faith on Roman law, it's important, and it's important to look at the trajectory of that. So, Constantine, I'll highlight three changes that he made. Number one, he gave um, women the right to inherit and manage property. So, he upheld existing Roman provisions that allowed women, especially widows, to own and manage their property, but he enhanced that protection because what got added was these Christian values of singleness and celibacy and independent Christian giving, like Luke 8:3. Constantine decreed that widows should not be defrauded, exploited, or pressured into a remarriage, which sometimes happened. Number two, he increased the punishment of rape, which means women owned their own bodies. So Constantine made rape a capital offense. That's really serious. And in a major shift, he protected the woman, not just her family's honor, but the woman herself. And so a rapist could now be executed along with any accomplices, right? If there was some kind of plot or conspiracy to pressure the woman. And third, there was pretty high restrictions on forced prostitution. Constantine criminalized the forced prostitution of girls and women. Parents or guardians who sold their daughters into prostitution could be punished. Traffickers could face very severe penalties. And and that was a big change because earlier Roman law ignored sexual exploitation completely. Then in the 500s, there was a power couple, Justinian and Theodora, emperor and empress. When their story by itself is really interesting because when Justinian met Theodora, she was an actress, which almost certainly meant at some point she had been a prostitute. So their courtship was the talk of the town. And when they got married, it's almost certain that she influenced Justinian to give even more protections to women, especially vulnerable women. They were both Christians. So, again, three categories here. One, they gave a wife legal protections from her husband to have child custody, to keep property in case of divorce. Also, Roman women could be pressured sometimes into marriage, like if the suitor proposed in public in front of her family. That was really hard to say no to. Their new law required the woman to give her consent twice, once at the proposal, and then again before the marriage ceremony at some point. This allowed her to change her mind graciously and in a way that was, culturally acceptable. Number two, there used to be a ban on intermarriage between social classes. Roman culture and society was very stratified by class. Theodora and Justinian got rid of that ban, almost certainly because it reflected directly on them. But it meant that poor women, even theater workers and prostitutes like Theodora, had way, way better marriage prospects and also then opportunities to manage property, own property too. And third, they gave even more rights to women over their own bodies. So if a woman was raped, then not only could the rapist and his associates be put to death, the rapist's property was immediately given to the rape victim. That's huge. Also, prostitutes used to be tied to brothels by these oaths, quote unquote, to never leave. And the brothel owners, the pimps, forced them to stay on the basis of these, quote, oaths. Theodora made these oaths illegal and mandated that the local Christian bishop actually had the authority to liberate a woman from prostitution if the governor failed to uphold the law. So that's pretty interesting. And then finally, in the realm of criminal justice, they moved female prisoners from under the watch of male guards because their male guards probably were abusing and raping them. And they moved the female prisoners into a nunnery under the supervision of other women, which Theodora herself ordered these nunneries constructed. These are big changes, and you could totally see the impact of Christian faith on policies. Again, I'm not saying that Justinian and Theodora as people were like role models. That's much more complicated as a question, but the impact of Christian faith and Christian thought on their policies is what we want to point out here.
Mm. Yeah, I think that even secular historians will generally concede that conditions improved for women as a direct result of early Christianity. Unfortunately, things did not keep on improving for women in the Christian world. In fact, I think that so much of the empowerment or disempowerment of women depends on a woman's relationship to place. And that's something that we can see really clearly in the story where it goes from this point, because Western European markets in the Middle Ages were very land based. So a woman's relationship to her ancestral lands or property after she was married was really a key feature of how she was going to be able to operate in the marketplace. So, if we think about a land based economy, they all really have the same basic problem, which is what are you going to do about generational turnover? And you're going to do one of two things. You will either practice partible inheritance or impartible inheritance. So, In partible inheritance, the land is divided into equal parts and bequeathed to multiple heirs. Impartible inheritance is where the land stays consolidated by being bequeathed to one heir. Now, the partible inheritance plan sounds fair and good, but the problem with it is that with every new generation, the land would be further subdivided. So, for small peasant families, this was a problem because a plot of land that was divided into three parts might not be enough for a family to survive on. For wealthy landholders, they did not want to divide the land because every subdivision would dilute the power of that family in their context. So, partible inheritance also tended to cause these bloody feuds where all of the competing heirs would fight each other to the death, and the last man standing would just get everything because he's the only one left to inherit. And that's where we get the system of primogeniture, which I think we talked about in episode 5, which is the right of the firstborn. In this system, the firstborn son is designated as the primary or maybe even the sole inheritor of the land. From an economic standpoint, um, younger sons became problems to get rid of rather than equal inheritors. They would talk about disposing of sons, and they didn't mean like we're throwing them in the trash. They meant like we need to get rid of them and not have them be like on the family estate anymore, but we need to do it in a way that's nice and like give them a decent living. And the way they would usually do this is they would send younger sons into respectable professions like the law or the church. And that's why you have all these clergymen in Jane Austen's novels, is because it was a way for the family to be like, we built this church and this parish is on our land, and our son is going to be the pastor, and he's going to get all of the tithe money, which was mandatory. You had to pay tithe. So he could stay on the family land. He's getting income, but he's not dividing up the land.
Mm. So that is quite a bummer for the not firstborn, but I choose that over dying in a bloody family feud. And I think most people would, but that wouldn't be my choice because I'm a girl. So where did the girls fit in?
So daughters, if you think about it, were even less ideal candidates for inheriting land because of this practice of vera locality. And vera locality is just the cultural expectation that when a daughter marries, she is going to physically leave her family's home and move into her husband's home, and sometimes part of her move into her in-laws' home, depending on what culture it is. This is why women in Western societies have traditionally taken their husband's last name, is because it formalizes her new family allegiance. So, because of the fact that daughters are seen as marrying out of a family, any property that the daughter inherited would be moving out of the family as well. So, fathers did want to be fair to their daughters. They wanted to pass on family wealth to them, but they weren't going to do that usually by giving them land. So instead, they used a system called the dowry system. And it was not totally impossible for a dowry to include land, but usually it was going to be movable property.
Mm.
So things like jewelry, um, or household goods. If you were poorer, you might get like some cooking equipment or things to start a business. If you were wealthy, it might be like really expensive furniture, stuff like that. But in later centuries, it would increasingly just be this one time cash payment that she would get when she got married.
Yeah, that doesn't seems like you got something. You didn't get nothing. You got jewelry, you got money. Not that bad on the surface, right?
No, it's actually not bad, and it could have been a good system. And in some places and sometimes it was a good system, because it could act as a personal safety net for women, or as a last resort emergency fund for the family if they were experiencing debt or other kinds of financial hardship. Many pre modern cultures, including pre colonial northern India, and I would argue ancient Israel, acknowledged a woman's right to control the wealth that she brought into the marriage. So, this control was a major part of the reason why dowry would often involve jewelry. When a woman wore her dowry wealth on her person, there was just this natural and sometimes formal taboo against a husband or a husband's family seizing those assets and putting them to use as they saw fit. The parable of the 10 coins in Luke 15, where the woman loses one of her 10 coins and then she finds it and she's all happy. That was
Yeah.
probably part of a headpiece made of dowry coins.
Mm.
And so you can see how she would be wearing that all the time and she's always going to have control over it because it's on her. Cash dowries were practical in a lot of ways, as cash tends to be, but they also removed a cultural and practical and psychological barrier between a husband and his wife's dowry wealth.
Mm.
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot easier to use money in a joint bank account, no matter where it came from, than to say, "Hey, honey, give me your wedding ring because I want to hawk it because I want to buy myself a new Xbox," right? That would just be crazy.
Yeah, it would feel weird
Exactly.
to say that.
Yeah, and that interprets this custom of women wanting expensive wedding jewelry. That's not just looking cute. That's not vanity. That jewelry is your economic security that you literally are showing everybody you're wearing it. Like, you can't come take this off of me. It's attached to me. That's security.
Yeah. So, this question of who controls the wealth that a bride brings into marriage was resolved in England and elsewhere in Europe through this legal doctrine of coverture. Coverture operated really very similarly to male guardianship in Imperial Rome. It's based on this idea that when a man and a woman marry, they become one flesh. So that's that biblical idea that comes from Genesis 2. But the thing about coverture is it says when man and woman become one flesh, that one flesh is the husband. So the wife kind of just disappears into him, and that's how they become one. And the husband has to act as the legal representative for both of them. In theory, coverture was supposed to be okay for women because the thinking was, well, the husband and wife's interests are so intertwined that the husband would never do anything that would be against her interests because they're one flesh. He's not going to want to do something that would harm her because it would hurt himself. That's a great theory. I would love if that were true. But in practice, coverture actually allowed unscrupulous husbands to very easily raid their wife's dowries and use that for any purpose that they saw fit. It made it, of course, extremely difficult for wives to leave an abusive or unfaithful husband because they had no way to support themselves. Coverture plus a generous dowry was actually dangerous for women because it was a attractor for fortune hunters, and that was something that was practiced pretty shamelessly by social climbers or by those younger sons that the parents were trying to dispose of. Like, we're not going to give you land, so you need to marry somebody with money who can take care of you. A surprisingly common form of financial fraud was a man who would pay witnesses to say that he had married a woman, even if she already was married, or if she had said, I don't want to marry you. He would say, I'm already married to this really wealthy woman. She exchanged vows with me, and now she's my wife, and her money is my money. Um, so that was one way that women could be a target of these fortune hunters. There's also the fact that the age of consent had not changed from that 12-year-old age of consent that we talked about back in Imperial Rome. That's still what it was all through the Middle Ages. So, another strategy is, I mean, we all know how middle school girls are. It was very easy for an adult man to, seduce these very young teenage girls and convince them, come run away with me, go to Scotland where we don't have to get our or your parents' approval to get married. And the next morning he would have control of all of her wealth.
Mm. What time is it now? Let me see. Oh, it's Pride and Prejudice time. That is a plot because there are seasons and times for Pride and Prejudice, and it's many times. You have to watch it many times a year. That's a plot, right? Mr. Wickham seduces and almost marries Georgiana, Mr. Darcy's sister, when she was 14. Why? Because she stood to inherit 30,000 pounds when she married. And so he was trying to get away with marrying her, and then he go and watch it. It's wonderful. It's Pride and Prejudice o'clock. So yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Never a bad time to watch Pride and
Mm-mm.
Prejudice.
Mm-mm.
Um, and Wickham is a terrible guy, and we all
Mm-hmm.
hate him. And
Mm-hmm.
it would be easy to think of all fortune hunters as being like George Wickham, and they're just terrible people.
Mm-hmm.
That's actually not really the case. There were fortune hunters who were just social climbers and ambitious and bad guys like George Wickham. But there were also a lot of young men from the upper classes who were desperate for cash because they had gotten themselves into crippling debt. The way that they got themselves into crippling debt was usually gambling. Gambling was a huge problem among the social elite in the early 19th century. So entire families could be totally bankrupted by these debts of honor that they weren't technically enforceable by the law, but it was just like a code of honor that you would never, never go back on paying those debts. Um, because it was tantamount to saying, I'm not an honorable person. My family is not honorable because they won't pay it either. And this happens actually in War and Peace. There's a character named Nikolai Rostov, and he gambles this impossibly large sum of money. He's kind of goaded into it by this other character, and he loses. And his and his family's solution to this huge problem is that he's going to break off his engagement with his childhood sweetheart, and he's going to find a rich heiress who will save them from financial ruin because once he marries her, all of her money is at their fingertips.
Like,
Oh my. So Nikolai was just looking for a sugar mama. Right.
He
So
was.
so at least he's not a terrible guy like George Wickham. He's just young and dumb. But that's a really good illustration because the coverture system gives him this way out, right? It's a financial life raft. And he and his family, they never considered not taking it. It's just a foregone conclusion.
I was gonna
Yeah,
say, let's just go back to the good old days of
the
marriage,
good old
when
days.
the youngest sons had to be the pastor, and people were stealing your money and you needed to wear all of your money in metal on your body. Just the good old uncomplicated leave it to beaver coverture, Mr. Wickham. It was so simple. Was it?
Yeah, before feminism ruined everything.
Before-
Yeah. Oh, these feminists. Let's go back to the good old days. Yeah.
So even like after that, debt is really a big part of the story, like all the way through. It continued to be one of the major ways that women would be harmed by coverture well into the 19th and even really the 20th century. Abigail Scott Duniway was an early advocate for women's property rights. She was a woman who had settled in the Western states with her family when she was a girl. And she experienced the way that debt could impact women two times. So, with her father, he had actually co signed on his brother's loan, and his brother was a total deadbeat and defaulted on the loan. And they ended up losing their farm, and that is why they moved out west. And he did not consult with her mother about co signing on this loan. And when they moved out west, he did not even allow her to bring things like her wedding china and these things that were her personal property had to be sold off because they just didn't have room in the covered wagon to bring it all. But her mother was not a part of any of those decisions, and it was actually heartbreaking for her. And she actually died along the way. Fun fact. That's not very fun. Um,
Mm.
but then it happened again in her adult life. She married this guy who actually he was a really nice guy. He was very forward thinking in a lot of ways. But he too was used to this idea that I can make financial decisions on my own and I don't need the say so of my wife. So he guaranteed a loan for a friend who ended up defaulting because he had a bad harvest. They lost their farm again to be able to pay off this loan. So it's not always a case of this is just a cartoon villain who's coming trying to steal stuff from these poor innocent women. It's just that the inertia of an inherently unjust system is always going to make it easy for even good people to make bad choices.
That's really important to highlight how husbands and wives interact with a kind of our modern financial system, because there are parallels. Like when let's say in one marriage, like if a husband really is making all the financial decisions, then his choices are reflected on his wife's credit score too. And if they then get a divorce for whatever reason, she's up a creek. So, making financial decisions together, even when there is only one earner, is so important because all those decisions are going to affect both spouses.
Darling, looks like I'll need an extra $20.
I'm not. What did you do with the money I gave you yesterday?
I gave every cent to a little old tramp who came to the back door, delivering our groceries.
We've just seen a clip from a 1962 episode of The Dick Van Dyke Show. And this was 42 years after women got the right to vote in America. And I actually think we're still seeing some coverture in that episode. Do we agree with that?
Definitely, this was the first time I saw it, but it reminds me of the opening to the Jetsons, right?
Mm,
The cartoon when I was a kid, where George Jetson is trying to give his wife money and drop her off, and she takes his wallet. But like 3 points about this clip. Number one, Laura just wants to go grocery shopping to get food for the family, but she has to do this
mhm.
whole ritual of asking Rob for money. And then, she has to endure this little lecture about, before she gets what she needs to go shopping. Uh, Number two, she's doing labor, right, for the family because shopping is work. But the narrative is flipped to make it seem like Rob is being so generous to give her some extra money. And number three, not only is she working for free, she's made to feel like she's getting something instead of giving something to the family. And so the whole script of this is weird.
Mhm. Mhm. It feels sitcom, ha ha,
Mm.
light, and not like it's a big deal, but there are some heavier things going on below the surface. So if we can connect all these things together, how did coverture get all the way from Pride and Prejudice and Sensibility to the Dick Van Dyke Show?
So when the US threw off British rule, we all think, oh, yeah, then we were all free. Great. But they actually kept a lot of the British law code in the American law system. And one of the things that they really left almost completely unchanged was a lot of the laws that affected women's property rights, including and especially the doctrine of coverture. During the 19th century, the principle of coverture was gradually starting to weaken in American law and British law, but often these changes would be motivated by the financial interests of men more than the financial independence of women. So, for instance, in 1835 and in 1839, the Married Women's Property Acts were passed in Arkansas and in Mississippi. And they were, on the surface, supposed to help women protect their own property, but really they were designed to insulate male plantation owners' property from being seized by creditors. And then in 1862, there was something called the Homestead Act, which did entitle women on the Western frontier to claim public land. But since any of the produce and the earnings from that land was just going to go into the husband's pocket and into his control, this was really just a way for a man to get two land claims instead of one. And that actually produced the same kind of dynamic as dowry did, where all of a sudden these men are like, I can get two parcels of land. I'm going to go get a wife. And Abigail Scott Duniway, who we just talked about, actually stipulated, I am not going to claim land because I don't want that to be a motivating factor for a man to propose to me. So she just flat out said, if you want to marry me, you're not going to get more land out of it. Even when women who had outside employment earned money, they had to turn those earnings over to their husbands. And it was becoming harder and harder for women to just ignore and put up with this because this was when there was a rampant alcoholism problem. And that was a result of how cheap alcohol had become in the early 1800s. And the alcoholism made men unemployable, for one thing. Nobody wants to hire somebody who is drinking all day long. But it also meant that they wasted their money on liquor, and then there wasn't enough for the family to just have basic necessities. It was also associated with domestic violence, which the link there is more complicated than they made it out to be, but they definitely, in their own minds, were like, drinking makes men violent.
This is it brings up such an important point for modern times. Substance abuse and addiction in modern marriages, like it's complicated. I know that there are discussions
Mm,
about, okay, is that grounds for divorce? I mean, I think it is, but
mm,
when we're talking about finances and like owning property, it is so important too, because I know uh, situations in churches where the advice is, if the husband is the alcoholic, for example, we the I think it's wise for the wife to have full access and control of the family funds, and for her then to give and some money to the husband for things that he's going to do, but that prevents him from gambling the money away or drinking the money away. And I think that makes sense under a, a a paradigm of, well, marriage is for the companionship, right? Not just for a man to own property, and therefore, that if they agree, and hopefully they do, that a husband and wife could arrange for property to be shared like that, at least for a season.
Yeah. And, many women in this time, they were looking at their lives and kind of blamed alcohol consumption for all of their family problems. And their answer to this moment was, I'm going to become a supporter of temperance and maybe even go as far as to say alcohol should be totally prohibited because that's going to solve all of my problems.
alcohol is bad. Alcohol is one of the things that you can't just quit on your own if you're really deep in it. Like, you
Mhm,
need
mhm.
medical help. You cannot stop drinking. So we need a medical establishment helping with that. But even with as grim as alcoholism is, opioid abuse, all kinds of other drug abuse, sports gambling, that's a thing that's going on now. There's so many other things that makes marriage for women, for everybody, really, really fraught.
And I think it's very easy for women, especially at that time, to willfully not see the powerless position that they were in. And
Mm,
alcohol is something they were allowed to criticize. Like, it was
mm,
very
Mm.
encouraged.
mm,
It was very in line with this idea of the Victorian woman as the angel of the hearth,
yeah.
and she was going to speak out against these social evils. But the thing that she could not speak out against was her own financial disempowerment. So
Mhm,
Abigail Scott Duniway was a very rare exception to that rule. She
mhm,
looked at the problem and she said, the problem is not that alcohol is legal. The problem is that we don't have the power to control our own property, and we are completely at the mercy of men who are, in some cases, making some really, really poor choices, and then they do not absorb the consequences of the choices. So they don't
mm.
feel it and they don't change their behavior. They just keep on um, doing these really toxic patterns that are simply experienced by their wives and children. Women did gradually gain more power over their finances. But I think it's important that we understand, because I think when we look at feminist history, we see, oh, women got the vote. We're done. Like, feminism has accomplished its goal. But the law is far from the only institutional power that exists in our lives. And it can absolutely, there are other institutions that can be used to keep women financially dependent on men. We talked about this really briefly earlier in the episode, but by the 1960s, banks and other credit institutions were the gatekeepers of how money was going to be used. So if you needed to buy a house or you needed to start a business, you're probably going to need a loan from the bank in order to do that on any kind of competitive level. The first general use credit card was issued by Bank of America in 1958, and it was called the Bank AmeriCard, and eventually rebranded as the credit card that we all know and love, Visa. So even credit cards were issued by banks, and banks had the power to say, I'm going to issue a credit card to this person, but not this person. I think that they're too much of a financial risk. And that became a really powerful force in women's lives, was banks just looking at, oh, I see Mrs. before the name, and I don't think this is somebody who should get a credit card unless the husband says, you can give her a credit card and I'll be responsible for how she uses it.
Right. Well, with all of that in mind, we can check in with Rob and Laura again.
Hey, what's this? One of Laura's gloves. Don't you think she's going a little heavy on the starch? What's inside?
Well, I don't know, but it's not a human hand. I mean, at least not life as we know it now.
Must be something that Laura's hiding, huh?
Come on, Laura's not a hider.
Hey, it's a bank book.
Mrs. Laura Petrie. Isn't that cute? She's got a little nest egg of her own.
Cute. You really think that's cute, huh?
Well, so she has a few dollars in a little private bank account. How much could it be?
Okay, how much?
Well, I don't even have to look. It can't be more than just a little pittance. $378.
A little pittance.
So she has a big pittance. A pittance. Well, maybe she's just setting aside a little for a rainy day.
$378? Boy, that's enough for the monsoon season.
Well, now, why do wives put aside a little for a rainy day? What's wrong with that?
Well, nothing. But why is the money just in her name? I mean, listen, if it rains, doesn't she care if you get wet?
So for reference, in that clip, it says that there was $378 in Laura's account. In today's money, that would be about $4,000. As you can see from that clip, women could open a savings account on their own initiative, because a savings account does not have any kind of line of credit. It does not involve any risk to the bank to let you put money in a savings account and take it out when you want to. What Laura would not have been able to do is to open a checking account. She would not have been able to open a credit card. Like I said, a husband had to have a credit card issued to his wife. And even on the card, it was not going to have Laura Petrie. It would have Mrs. Rob Petrie, to make it very clear when she used that card that he was going to be legally on the hook for those charges.
Mm-hmm. That is coverture. That the bank is only issuing a credit card to women who are under the financial cover of their husbands.
And watching this episode again and thinking about the radical feminists of the 60s, people might think, well, what's the big deal about this? And why are we talking about this clip? I mean, the big deal is that credit was and is a huge part of how you ran your life and how the market operated, how it still operates today, right? So think of all the things you would not be able to do if you couldn't get a personal credit card. If you're a woman, it would have limited your access to housing or maybe buying a car, because you can't get a home loan or now a car loan, which means you can't take that job that's farther away, or something like that. It limits your ability to compete in the marketplace, because if they opened their own business, they wouldn't have access to the same credit lines and opportunities as their male competitors. So it just gets bigger and bigger, the higher up you go.
All right, what is this?
That's my glove, and what are you doing with it?
I would just like to know why you think it necessary to hide a bank book in here.
Rob, how could you? You looked in my private glove.
I would like to know why you think you have to have your own private bank account.
Because I do, that's why.
All right, then. The next logical question is, what is wrong with the money in our joint account?
Well, that's our account and our money. This is my money.
Your money?
Yes, Rob, I want some money that's mine to spend on anything I want. It's important to me. I don't want everything coming from you.
And where did you get this money?
From you?
Well, isn't it all the same thing, then? Either you get money from me or you get money from that, which came from me.
No, Rob, it's completely different. I put this money in a little at a time. At first it's from you, but then after it lies around for a while, I forget that it came from you, and then it's from me.
So, what you didn't see in that clip is that when Rob finds out that Laura is secretly setting aside money, the first thing that he starts worrying about is that she is trying to get into a financial position to leave him. And that's why he's so upset. And that's why he confronts her and wants to know, why in the world do you think that you need to have your own private money?
Mm.
Ooh, and that is telling because Rob and Laura represented the typical suburban couple in the 1960s, right? The early 60s, I think. And we could
Mhm.
assume that the producers thought the financial dynamics in the Petrie's marriage was what people at least thought was normal, right? Even if they weren't experiencing it themselves, they thought, yeah, we know people like that.
Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, if anything, the Petries were actually perceived as pretty progressive and up to date. Barry Tyler Moore was actually the first TV actress to regularly wear pants on any TV sitcom. So they are definitely not being portrayed as this is a really backwards traditional couple. Despite the financial power that Rob clearly does hold in this marriage, you're supposed to see him as just like a lovable goofball who has a little bit of power, but it's mostly just ceremonial. And you're supposed to see Laura as usually a confident and even liberated woman in this marriage.
Yeah, and I really really think that we have to remember that this was scripted. This wasn't real. What goes into producing a TV show is that people are going to sit around and write that script. The network is going to approve it. They're going to rehearse those actors and they're going to make them deliver a line a certain way and put your hand right here and look in that direction. And no, don't do that. Do this instead. They're going to get notes every time and then they're going to record it. And then if they don't like it, they're going to do it again. So none of this is real. If Laura is liberated and feisty and fun, but she's ultimately a very financially dependent housewife, this is fictional. That's not real. The whole marriage is rehearsed and curated and cultivated for you to see. In real life, this kind of financial condition does not make people feel more trusting of each other. It doesn't promote closeness and it doesn't promote intimacy. This was all fake.
hmm And I think you see that anxiety actually in Rob's perspective because I kind of feel for the guy in this episode. He does experience this anxiety, which I think is
Mm,
understandable. But it's also a very well worn male fear when you have this established precedent that I control the money. And even if you're not thinking of it consciously, in the back of your mind, you know, she really can't leave me. I don't ever have
yeah.
to worry about being alone because where is she going to go? Um, but along with that stability, you also get this anxiety where you're in the back of your mind, you're always wondering, but if she could, would she? Like, would she stay with
Hmm.
me if she didn't have to? And that's
Hmm.
just sad for a man to have to live in a marriage and wonder that. I don't think that's good for men either. Or even looking at it before somebody gets married, this idea that I can be confident that some woman is going to say yes to my proposal because every woman that I see knows she has to marry somebody. It's like Mr. Collins in Pride and Prejudice, where he's like,
Hmm.
"You're not accepting my marriage proposal? Like, what do you think you're going to live on?" And
Right.
that is the attitude that you get when women are financially dependent on men
Mm,
is men get more of a reassurance that they are going to be able to marry and that they
mhm.
will have wives that will stay with them. But the cost of that for men is that they really never know whether that woman would choose them if she didn't have to.
Exactly. This kind of system is society participating in a mass effort of risk reduction for men. Men don't have to take the risk. Women don't have a choice. So are the women actually free to choose to love them? Again, if I open the door, do the bunnies love us? Are they going to leave and not come back and be like, "I'm so glad to be done with those fools. I'm eating this outside food." Because I'll never know because I'll never open the door. I'm never letting those little bunnies go. Maybe men should think about not doing so much risk reduction and reframing that as like, oh, we're just trying to protect women or something. Maybe you need to just take the risk and get love as a result.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think that that risk, it's hidden because it's so embedded in our traditions that we don't even see it anymore.
Mm,
We talked about Vera locality earlier, the wife moving away from her family of origin to live with her husband, who would usually remain in the same area as his family, or maybe even the same house with his parents. Um, Vina Oldenburg is a Indian writer who is a historian, and she writes that Vera locality is actually a major factor in this social phenomenon of bride burning that you see in northern India. So, upon marriage, the woman would leave her home and family to live with a husband, usually in laws too, that she may not even know. And if she's not able to integrate well into that family, she instantly becomes vulnerable to neglect, to mistreatment, and in some very extreme cases, murder. The reason why burning is a favored tactic is because it can be easily staged to look like it's just a kitchen accident. And often the husband's relatives are helping him carry this out. It's even actually sometimes their idea, especially the mother in law. There's often a lot of friction between a daughter in law and a mother in law. And if the
mm,
mother in law doesn't like you, um, sometimes those mother in laws will go to great extremes to get rid of a daughter in law that they don't like.
mm,
Wow, a kitchen accident. I mean, it's home for me in many ways, but
mm,
just to say, Vera locality is the opposite of what the Bible says in Genesis 2:24, that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined with his
mm,
wife. I mean, it's I suppose taken for granted, right? That a woman will leave her father and mother too, but it was as I've explained elsewhere, my own mom's experience was to join my dad and his family and become the lowest ranking member of his family. And I don't think that's universal in Japanese culture, but I don't think it's uncommon either. So what we're talking about here is something that is totally the opposite of God's vision and what
mhm.
we're trying, the relationships that we're trying to restore.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's an abuse tactic to isolate somebody from their family. And I'm not
Mm.
saying
Mhm,
that every single culture and every single family that has practiced fear locality is abusive, but um there's a reason why cultures have thought it's more okay for women to be exposed to that risk than for men. When for men, it
mhm,
wouldn't even really be that big of a risk. I don't think that men are going to be murdered and made to look like an accident if they live in their with their wife's family.
right.
Um
Right.
it compounds the vulnerability even more when the
Mhm,
woman is away from everybody that she knows. She comes to this family that they don't know her. They can't possibly care about her the way that her own family does because she's a stranger to them. She's an outsider, and in a way she's kind of a threat.
yeah, yeah. I mean, talk about men minimizing risk and how the risk goes to women, right? You forget about kitchen accidents and murders and being alone. Even changing your last name to your husband's carries risk. I'm not saying don't do it, although maybe don't right now. I did it. Rachel did it. We changed our last name. Mako did not. So, that's the reality. But let us for a moment hold in our hands for just a second the risk that happens for women when you change your last name. It's going to impact your professional life to change your last name. It makes establishing your citizenship more complicated. If your last name is different from that's on your what is on your birth certificate, you have to keep a hard copy of a certified proof of name change. There's an extra burden on women when it comes to paperwork maintenance and voting access and even maybe the ability to stay in the country. And I tell you, when I got married, I told them, "Give me as many copies of my marriage license as you can." I think I had like 8 original copies because I didn't trust anybody. I was like, "I did change my name." And I have those documents with me at my fingertips all the time of name changes because that I don't trust that the paperwork is gonna be right anywhere else. Men don't have to deal with this. They're born, their name, they have it, they die, they have the same name. The risk is held by women, not men.
Right, and of course, the elephant in the room, right, is male authority and female submission. So we see it in uh, even like certain wedding vows, like in the traditional vows, men promise to love, honor, and cherish, but the women promise to love, honor, and obey. Like
Mm,
that is jarring to me now.
right.
And it shouldn't even have to be said that making a vow to obey involves more risk than not. Like the person not making a vow to obey, what's at stake for them?
Obeying is a lot more black and white than like, I am cherishing you. I'm going with my this is cherishing. But obeying is like a lot more easy to prove or disprove. Like again, men are trying to minimize their risk.
Hmm.
I think we can safely say that women have been treated more like men's property than like the co owners of the world alongside men. And that's exactly what we would actually expect to find from Genesis 3:16. And this conversation is not complete without a discussion of some of the relevant verses. So coverture was rationalized by appealing to Genesis 2:24, where it says that the husband and the wife will become one flesh. Easy, right? Coverture said that when a man and woman become one flesh, the husband is now in charge of this one flesh united body because he's a head and the wife has to submit to him. We've all heard that one. So, if this is true, then it does make sense that the man would, in a sense, own the woman in the same way that he owns his own body. So, is the Bible itself teaching that men own their wives?
So I will answer that with a story from our premarital counseling days. Not the best days of my life, by the way. Um, when my husband and I were in premarital counseling, we were assigned a book to read, and there was a section that was talking about, your future sexual intimacy, and the author of the book quoted from 1 Corinthians 7:4, and he said, "For the wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does." I have always been fairly biblically literate. That comes from being in a very fundamentalist family, for better or for worse. So I was mad because I knew right away that is one half of that verse. And the second half says, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. So, to answer your question straight on, yes, the Bible does teach that the husband owns his wife's body. But it also teaches that a woman owns her husband's body. And that
Mhm.
really changes things because neither of those two statements is truer than the other. It's not like the husband 100% owns his wife's body, but the wife kind of like 70% owns the husband's body. Like, no, it is full mutual ownership of each other.
The, the actual Bible, inspired by God, in 1 Corinthians 7 is not about sex on demand for men. It's not about that. It's about mutual ownership. It's about being co owners together. And you're not doing anything without mutual consent. Is that what it is?
That's it. That's exactly what it is. That's the only way that it can work, to have a one flesh union where you own each other's bodies. You have to check in with
Hmm.
each other. And I have this saying that I say to my daughters all the time because they're at the age where they fight a lot. And one of the things I run into is my older daughter will try to get my younger daughter to like play a game that she doesn't really want to play and she's not enjoying it anymore. And so I say all the time, if it's not fun for everybody, it's not fun at all. And
Hmm.
I think that's really what mutual ownership should look like in marriage. If the husband really believes that his wife's is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh, then why would he want to do something with her body that's not fun for her, that feels even painful or humiliating? That doesn't make any sense.
Right.
Nor with a shared bank account.
Hmm.
No.
And so I think mutual submission is it's the logical implication of mutual authority. Ephesians 5:22 is often used to promote this one directional submission, even though what is being said there, wives submit to your husbands, the verb submit is not actually there in Greek. It's actually borrowed from verse 21, which is submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. So it's not one-sided submission. The plain meaning of the text is mutual submission.
Right.
Yes. Yes. I really like this quote from Frances Power Cobb, who is a British activist. In 1868, she writes this about the union that's created by the legal precedent of coverture. She says, for the most absolute type of union of all, we must seek an example in the tarantula spider. As most persons are aware, when one of those delightful creatures is placed under a glass with a companion of his own species a little smaller than himself, he forthwith gobbles him up, making him thus, in a very literal manner, bone of his bone, supposing tarantulas to have any bones, and flesh of his flesh. So that's like a very dramatic illustration, but it's true. There's more than one way to become one flesh. And the most obvious way to do it is just when one creature consumes the other. And you can have a marriage like that, but it's not what God wants. And
Mm.
mutuality protects marriage, it protects the one flesh union from becoming that.
Yeah.
Right, because what happens to the big tarantula when he gobbles up the smaller one? He's all alone again. And that brings us full circle to what God said in Genesis 2. It's not good for the man to be alone.
Without a woman or a girl.
Thanks for being with us today. If you're enjoying this, you may be wrestling with other questions like, is hell just a prison and God holds the keys? Should Christians just accept climate disasters and the suffering of the masses? Should Christians just dominate the public square? Have we inherited the most accurate version of the Christian faith? We tackle issues like these head on. If you want bread and butter resources, check out our Bible studies and evangelism tools and spiritual formation material. If you want answers to tough questions, check out Reconstruction. If you want to live out Christian restorative justice, check out A Long Repentance, or Plantation Capitalism versus Jesus' Jubilee Economy, or Abortion Policy in the US. You can find our content on our website, our YouTube channel, and on our asynchronous learning platform, or join a live class with one of our instructors. We want to connect with you, whether you're a believer or a skeptic.